Hello viewers. Today we are going to talk about a phenomenon that historians have generally spoken of as industrialization before industrialization, or rather the age of proto-industry. In the 17th century, Europe was confronted with a serious agrarian crisis where people in the countryside had to adopt multiple strategies to deal with a crisis, so deep was it. Earlier in the 16th century, with rising crop prices, even small and marginal farmers used to live well, even as wealthier peasants, of course, lived better. But in the 17th century, as crop prices began to fall, big peasants survived, but smaller and marginal peasants were left struggling. Such small and marginal farmers often resorted to other vocations other than agriculture, that is to say, such as animal husbandry or artisanal activities. This rise of artisanal activity took place in the countryside in the backdrop of a further crisis in the urban manufacturing sector as well, which developed together into the phenomenon of proto-industry. There are, it is said, two different routes to proto-industry. The first one is spoken of as a Kauf system, where the artisan manufactured the commodity using his own raw materials, his own tools of production, most of the time in his own home, and then sold the commodity to a merchant who came along to buy it. Very often, production loan for this purpose was also forwarded by the merchant, which helped the artisan tide over his immediate financial crisis. The second route was known as the Verlag system, where the merchant would put out materials, that is to say, the merchant would commission the production of a particular commodity, would provide the artisan with raw materials, sometimes also with tools of production, and once the product was ready, he would collect it directly from the artisan. Motive force behind these two routes of Kauf system and Verlag system happened to be the merchant capitalist. In order to understand the rise of the merchant capitalist, one has to visualize European society in the 17th century, European rural society in the 17th century. A merchant capitalist could begin from an enterprising peasant who decided to market the surplus he grew from somewhere outside his village, maybe to a local town or to a distant town, where he was likely to get more profit. The profit that he would earn from the distant market, he could then reinvest in production of something else that there was a demand for in the market. Such peasant turned merchants often gained a sense of distant urban markets by marketing the first surplus that he needs to go, and sometimes often he would come back and manufacture whatever else that he never prepared before, for which there was a demand in the distant market. Sometimes such entrepreneurial peasants would also request or commission his neighbors in the village to join him in production of such commodities, and he would even lend them a share of the profit by way of a seed capital which could be taken. This phenomenon E.J. Hobsbawm has spoken of as the primary path to capitalism, where the peasant himself turns into a merchant and then looks for profit and capital rather than simple money for consumption. The other route for the rise of merchant capitalist lay through the town-based merchants who ran generally the trade between town and country. Town needed agricultural commodities from the villages to survive, and that brought the merchant into the villages, where he could find that the peasant was manufacturing an item, a commodity for which there was a demand in the town, and the merchant would therefore carry more than agricultural crops from the country to the town. During the crisis of urban manufacturing, which gripped 16th century Europe, the mercantile classes of Europe took the initiative in creating an alternative infrastructure of manufacturing almost every item of daily use by resorting to this putting out system, where the merchant provided the tools of production, the raw materials, or at least the very least, the capital in order to get a commodity manufactured, bypassing the urban guild system. Putting out over a period of time became the mainstay of manufacturing activities in many pockets in different parts of Europe in course of the 17th century. According to very renowned historian Fernand Braudel, the proto-industrial experiment originated in the Dutch towns of Ghent, or if not Ghent, then Ypres. Others believe that it had begun already in the Mediterranean south, in the towns of Florence and Milan. German historians Peter Kreider, Hans Medic, and Jürgen Schlumbaum, however, argue that the experiment had already begun in the closing years of the 16th century in the southern and western regions of German-speaking Central Europe, and spread from there in other parts of Central Europe by the early 17th century. The application of twin policies of peasant protection, that is to say, defense of the rights of the incumbent peasant against feudal appropriation, and indivisibility of agricultural lands, which basically meant that only one child was to inherit the agrarian land in a family, which frequently left peasants, children from peasant families, younger children from peasant families, from access to control of peasant holdings, and often pushed them either towards part-time or even full-time artisanal production within the proto-industrial system. Although somewhat disturbed by the dislocating effect of the 30 Years' War, there was a regular drift in the direction of this tendency, which helped the people survive the period of uncertainty. In the second half of the 17th century, in the mineral-rich southern and western reaches of the German lands along the river Rhine, the Verlag system brought about a significant expansion in iron and metallurgical industries, leading to the rise eventually of the major industrial town of Krefeld. It became a veritable industrial hub in the Rhineland. The Swiss merchants also began to create a proto-industrial center of textile production in the German-speaking regions of Swiss Alps, bypassing the old traditional guild-dominated textile center of Zurich. The Swiss merchants also laid the foundations of renowned artisanal craft of clockmaking in the 17th century by investing in the proto-industrial apparatus of production in the Alpine region of Switzerland. Similarly, the Dutch textile center of Haarlem, which used to be the mainstay of linen production under the old guild system, was eventually displaced by peasantry from the southern region of Netherlands, along with those from the rural Wuppertal region of Germany, backed by the merchant capitalists of Wuppertal and Brabant. The most interesting experiment of proto-industry is best exemplified by the Dutch shipbuilding and textile industries. The introduction of the wind-powered timber mill in 1596 increased the supply of a large volume of timber at less cost and in a shorter span of time, and this encouraged merchant capitalists to ignore the guilds of existing shipbuilding towns. They went on to develop in the villages along the river Zaan a shipbuilding industry within the proto-industrial framework that was to become the largest in Europe and constituted the kernel around which the town of Amsterdam was to develop, which then went on to become a principal center, a trade entrepot on the North Atlantic seaboard. The case of Leiden and its dealings with proto-industry also established very clearly how established urban manufacturers with old traditions were to fight against the ascendant proto-industrial experimenters. Leiden in the Netherlands was the seat of what was considered to be the mainstay of the old style textile product, which is called old draperies. Flemish artisans who were fleeing from the town of Hoornschutter during the Dutch revolt settled down in the town of Leiden, where they introduced the new draperies, which was hitherto, as I said, known for specialized production of old draperies. So the same town of Leiden began to have both the production of old draperies within the guild system and the production of new draperies within the proto-industrial system. Accordingly, merchants in the Leiden area became keen on the production of new draperies simply because it was a new product. During the wars with Spain, the supply of wool was disrupted, and by 1670, there was a major revolt that disrupted the supply of wool from Spain even further. When this revolt came to an end and supply of wool resumed, the old draperies managed to fight back. The population of Leiden in course of this period of struggle between old draperies and new draperies increased from 1,200 in 1582 to over 70,000 in 1660. By the end of the 17th century, the market of old draperies also got a boost from its reorganization within the proto-industrial mode in the Dutch regions of Verviers, Eupen, and Monschau, and displaced the preeminence of Leiden's guild-based production of old draperies. That is to say, the proto-industrial system was adapted to an existing commodity production model, and the old guild-based system was replaced by proto-industrial system of manufacturing the same commodity of the old draperies. New draperies produced by the proto-industrial ventures of northern England, however, ate into the new draperies production of Leiden and effectively finished it off. The most fascinating case, however, in the 17th century in the realm of proto-industry was the rise of the manufacturing sector of England. The crisis of guild-based manufacturing had hurt the English manufacturing sector significantly, dependent on its export of woolen broadcloth. The English textile industry was severely hurt when the fall of agricultural prices in the late 16th, early 17th century disrupted the supply of wool, just as it had done for Leiden. The general depression in European economy during 1619 to 22 reduced English overall exports to the continent. The stagnating manufacturing sector in England this time happened to be saved by the proto-industrial production that was undertaken in the countryside. By the middle of the 17th century, they had displayed that the large number of people who had been displaced by the 30 Years' War also included a large number of Flemish textile workers and artisans who were brought over from the Netherlands and made to settle down in the southern regions of England under royal patronage. They turned the region called Norwich into principal center of production of the new draperies, which were completely new to England, in the countryside through the proto-industrial mode of production. Rising demand for the new draperies encouraged merchant capitalists to provide the resettled Flemish artisans with resources, raw materials, and also sometimes tools of production to start producing these new draperies in the countryside. By the early 17th century, 400 of the 650 new knitting frames were operating in the city of London itself because it was a large city, there was a residual demand, and therefore London began to experiment with the knitting frames of the new draperies. By 1727, most of the 7,000 knitting frames in England were operating in the countryside of East Midlands within the proto-industrial framework, and England became the principal force in the world of European textile exports. However, the proto-industrial system, for all the good things that can be said about its contribution to the recovery of European economy, had some problems. Both the Kauf system and in the Verlag system, the merchant was ultimately dependent on the goodwill of the man who was doing the ultimate production. So the artisans tended to look at the income from artisanal production as a kind of supplementary production. That is to say, their mainstay was agricultural occupation, and only when they needed supplementary income would they go for proto-industry. The implication was that the merchants could pay the artisans less than what they would generally have to pay artisans associated with the urban guilds, because the rural artisans' food requirements were taken care of. So it was cheaper to have something produced under the putting out system than it was in producing the urban guild system. Hence, the merchants would often invest a little bit of money and make profits much larger than they could have made in town. So the scale, volume, and the range of profit was much greater in proto-industrial system. But artisanal labor, the problem was not available during the harvest seasons. Because agriculture was the mainstay of all these people in the countryside, no uniformity of quality of production could also be guaranteed under the putting out system. So a producer might be more attentive, an artisan might be more attentive while producing one group of commodities, but he could perform badly while he was manufacturing another. The shape could be wrong, the content could be, the commodity could be somewhat damaged. So there was never any uniformity of quality production. Neither was there any guarantee that the commodity would be sold to the very merchant who had put out, or to the very merchant who had promised to buy. So the merchant might forward a capital, forward a loan for the purpose of production. The peasant might use that money for his personal family consumption, or he might actually manufacture the commodity but sell it to someone else. In such a situation, it was the merchant who would lose all the money in the first place. Accordingly, towards the beginning of the 18th century, merchants began, in England especially, but also elsewhere, to start experimenting with the concept of workshops, which eventually led to manufactories, that is to say, the factory. The factory system of production was coming into place on account of the inadequacies of the proto-industrial system, and proto-industry began its gradual and slow but gradual transition into the industrial system of production as the merchant capitalist converted himself into an industrial capitalist.